Hello everyone, I wanted to give you a little presentation about 4-point grading. We had some issues with our grading scales kind of recently. I've been taking a look at them in Power School. From a power teacher point of view, at least in Escanaba, there are some inconsistencies. The default scale is inconsistent with our student handbook. I want to try to streamline this process so we're all on the same page, and I thought I'd make a video explaining it so that we don't have to do a late night after school meeting once again. And I would like everyone to jump on board with this one. I think we're ready to discuss 4-point grading. Maybe I was a little preemptive in the past about introducing this, but I think we've seen enough of the key concepts to be able to move forward with it. Some of the problems that we've got with our current grades is that there's inconsistent grades, definitions for grades between teachers. Not everyone is able to define what an A is in their class and what it means for their students' learning. Our current grading system doesn't communicate success criteria. Often we'll have in our grade books things like Chapter 1, Test 5, Worksheet 4, as opposed to standards-based competency-based grading. Doesn't communicate what is actually learned by students. We are penalizing students for taking risks. Maybe not all of these things are true in your classroom specifically. These are more generalizations of traditional grading practices. Grades undermine new teaching practices. When we talk about averages, they're now often not consistent with what the teacher knows about student learning. In fact, averaging, as research shows, doesn't really reflect. It's the sort of the parachute. Who do you want to pack your parachute type of idea? I want the person who has met those achievement goals, as opposed to an average of what they may or may not have learned. Our current grades don't communicate success criteria. I guess I just said that one. Sorry about that. They don't communicate what is learned. Grading our first efforts is often retroactive of what we want students to do in practice. Demoralize students who learn more slowly. I think we can see that, and especially with our demographic of students. Sometimes they're arbitrary and subjective. They give little information about student strengths and weaknesses. They sort students rather than help them succeed, and their symbols of what they represent is unclear. So we'd like to streamline this process and grade for learning. Some of the traditional gradebook entries. I've kind of combed through a lot of our grade books, and they look a lot like this. Homework, quiz, Chapter 1. I see a lot of worksheets. Try to get away from those things, and we'll talk about standards and competency-based grades. Here's the solution. It's often called 4-point grading. Really, it's 5-point grading. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. A, B, C, D, F. Competency-based grading. Most technical colleges follow these things. A lot of our unions-based trades test along the lines of competencies. I'm looking for uniformity between teachers, a grading system that allows risk-taking and practice, provides success criteria, a clarity of what is to be learned, and again, we'll talk about achievements. How can this work for you? The easiest way to put it here is the first thing we need to do is determine what's going to actually be learned. I would recommend working backwards to figure out what you intend students to know by the end of the lesson. Your standards are going to be a really good guidebook. In fact, many of our standards could just be plugged right into the gradebook. I'll show you that later. We've got to think about a way to communicate our success criteria. Our rubric, our teacher evaluation rubric, is riddled with these things. We talk about learning targets and success criteria. And I'm going to show you too a couple of quotes and some things about how we should involve students in determining what that success criteria looks like. I think we could all do a lot better job of that, and I think you'll also find it makes your job easier. In fact, this entire process, the one thing to note is grades are very complicated, but in moving to a 4-point scale, in my experience, it seemed to really clarify grading. It took the emphasis off of grading and put it back onto learning, and just made sense to me, and there's just tons of research that supports this. Take a look at grades for grading for patterns of understanding, just like the teacher evaluations. And when we look at that example of packing the parachute, if we have a student who the first 5 tries doesn't do well, but at the end of the lesson or through repeated attempts is able to pack that parachute perfectly, then that student has met those benchmarks, has achieved those standards, has learned the content, and is competent in what was to be learned. Therefore, that student's grade should reflect that. I agree with these quotes. We must constantly remind ourselves that the ultimate purpose of education is to have students become self-evaluating. If students graduate from our schools still dependent on others to tell them when they are adequate, good, or excellent, we've missed the whole point of what education is about. If you are the sole judge of a student, it sets us up for some issues with behavior. If we're continually telling students, you're good, you're bad, you're adequate, we're the judge and jury, what we want to do is put ourselves on the same team as the student. Trust me on this one, your classrooms will be a better environment if we do that. Another quote by Stiggins: "A student's responsibility for their own learning can be achieved most effectively by consciously involving students in the assessment process. Students should be involved in designing or selecting assessment strategies, developing criteria, keeping records of their achievement, and communicating about their learning." Again, globally, I think we can all do a little bit better at this, and it's also in our teacher evaluation about locus of control, release of responsibility, formative assessment, and student data, and what the students are doing with that data. So please think of ways to involve students in their determining what their success criteria looks like. And finally, to the good stuff. A lot of times when we talk about these things, myself included, just tell me what you want me to do. I don't care about all the background behind it. Just show me what you want. So here it is. I'm going to bring up a Word file. So here you're going to see a couple of different examples of what 4-point grading means. This will help us define what a 4 is, what an A is, a B, a C. This scale delineates a few of the halves in between a 3 and a 4, more complex content, target objectives. We're looking at simpler content when we're looking at a level 2 learning. Students at a level 1 with help, partial success. Okay, so this helps us define what is actually happening, how much learning is evident in our students. We can take a look at another type of a scale here. This one makes most sense to me. When I was grading and when I was in the classroom, I never bothered with the 0.5s. I just did either a 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Made it pretty simple, and that was on all of my assignments. I didn't do a lot of testing in way of written tests, but I did do a lot of performance-based tests. We'll get to that in a little bit. I'll also show you some ways if you've got some summative written tests that you want to use. You can also, there'll be examples for how to grade those. But in general, most of my grade book was 0 through 4. And I think that through looking in your grade books, all of ours could be as well. For every performance task or can-do type of a thing, they can all be graded on a 4-point scale. And show these things to students. So a 3 or a B would be no major errors or omissions regarding any of the information, and or processes that were explicitly taught. In addition, students can inference applications that go beyond what's taught. Often, I wouldn't accept any performance-based criteria. Example, if a student was handing in a weld, I would have them redo those until they perfected it. Hence, they would get a 4 or an A, but isn't that what we want? We want students to be able to achieve that success criteria. It would be great if all of our students, I'm not talking about grade inflation, but I'm talking about all of our students meeting the learning targets, meeting the achievements, and meeting those competencies that we expect of them, especially when it comes to performance and skill-based criteria. Some other descriptors here. I am working in PowerSchool to make this happen for everyone, and we should be able to push that through in the next couple of days. But we should see some of these scales showing up this way: excellent, proficient, adequate, limited, and complete. I don't know if anyone recognizes this rating scale. I think most of our veteran CTE teachers would recognize this, as that comes right out of our SIP self-review. So even the state has a 4 or 5 point scale. Where can you use this? When can you use it? Before instruction to determine prior knowledge, during instruction, after instruction. Okay. From a student's point of view, they might formulate this in way of can-do statements. So when your students develop their success criteria, they might say things like, I can do everything that was taught without making mistakes. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But from a student point of view, these are called can-do statements, and can be quite a powerful thing for students using success criteria and data for navigating their own achievement. I'm going to flip back and forth here a little bit. I wanted to show you an example of an elementary school in our ISD that uses standards-based grading. Look at their grade entries and compare them to the traditional grade that I showed you earlier. In their grade books, they have things like knows content letter sounds, identifies sight words, demonstrates understanding of long vowel sounds. These are all things that a teacher is going to test a student on, generally by performance, and they're going to rate them using, in this case, they've got kind of a little bit of a different scale, but I would recommend using a 4-point scale. And it's not only a 4-point scale that I want you to tune into, but it's also your gradebook entries. These gradebook entries show demonstration of what's actually being learned. I grabbed a few of our standards, and we see things like these. These could actually be just gradebook entries. I realize not all of this you can fit in there sometimes, but these are actual competencies off of our welding standards, and this is what our gradebook could be set up as. And you would rate each one of these with a 4-point scale. These sort of things is what's considered standards-based grading. It's much more communicative of what students are to be learning and what they're supposed to be achieving, as opposed to Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Worksheet 4. These are all just standards I grabbed out of our SIP self-reviews. Do you see any words that are similar to our depths of knowledge, our DOK levels, or depths of learning that we've talked about in the past? We've got compares, investigates, understands, demonstrates. So these are all actual entries from standards that we could put into our grade books. I'm going to end here because I'm running out of time on this recording. I realize I'm going a little bit long here, but I've got just a couple of extra things to show you in a separate video, so watch for that.